The atmosphere was thick with expectancy, two exhausted nations at each other's throats for decades, clinging to fingernail tips on the threshold of a quantum leap no one would be foolish enough to dream of. Total and complete ceasefire, asserted U.S. President Donald Trump soap operatically, penning the tweet at the 11th hour on June 23, 2025. More a catchphrase than euphemistic expression of uncertain peace and effort at a rewind of the clock on what would come to be referred to as the 12-day war involving Iran and Israel. It started 2 weeks back. Spy intelligence, some U.S. satellites, and Israeli brains showed Iran's enrichment plants moving towards weapons grade. On June 13th, Israel conducted what it called a preemptive attack. Bunker buster bombs ripped through underground nuclear plants at Natanz Fordow and Isfahan. The attack struck military sites and scientific research sites. Iran hit back by dialing back ambition to be nuclear, but resolve solidified. Iran struck back in haste. Drone and missile poured down on the Israeli night burst. Air defense chatter crash sounds echoed the cities. Dozens dead, hundreds wounded. War became intimate. It broke into the texture of everyday life. The U.S., perceiving immediate threat to not just an ally but to regional stability, entered into the conflict over the weekend. Bunker-busting B-52s leveled Iranian nuclear facilities. Others embraced hardline, a threat to cripple facilities short of full-scale war Iran was raging against, but not at U.S. may not. It attacked Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar on June 23, the largest U.S. forward operating base in the Middle East. Luckily, early warning systems saved U.S. lives. Qatar intercepted almost all missiles, and only one hit, no U.S. casualties. Timing was impeccable, practically as if arranged for the purpose of drama, but held in a fashion that did not blow quite into all-out war. Trump grasped the opportunity. With a rare display of leadership, he moved in tandem with Israeli PM Netanyahu by phone, calling for Israeli restraint. His ambassadors, however, initiated back-channel diplomatic negotiations with Iran through Qatar and Oman. The Qatari emir served as an informal envoy master, carrying Tehran's counter-proposal across the Gulf. And thus came the ceasefire, a two-step slow-motion proposal. Iranian silence first for 12 hours after 4 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time, and then Israel returning in kind after 12 hours. If both were to be held to their promise, Trump declared the war would officially cease after 24 hours. But it was not peace, not yet. There were violations within hours. Iran was said to be firing 2 missiles into Israel on the first days of the ceasefire. Both were shot down. Israel struck back at a radar station outside Tehran. There was a Trump call then. Bring your pilots home. Calm down now. He bluntly growled an unusually blunt rebuke to Israel, his loyal ally. And thus a delicate tango began. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian declared a great victory, implying Iran was strong. Tehran state media stated being ready for dialogue, but indicated they had hands on the trigger. There were civilian voices to be heard in Tel Aviv. Hope and relief, and the anguished echo of shattered lives and smoldering homes. Better late than never, volunteered one resident, looking out upon wreckage but superimposing the future with a tentative olive branch. Markets all over the globe reacted. Oil prices dived to rubble. Global indexes rallied on the assumption that ships would still sail through Strait of Hormuz unharmed. But strategically, silently, red lines were being drawn. Iran, decisively beaten in a military context, still had valuable assets. Ability to cut off oil supply routes, its ballistic missile umbrella, and its proxy fighters in Hezbollah, Houthis, and Shia militias. When the night descended on June 24th, the world half hoped, not half believed. Ceasefire ruled. No bell. Rumor of Trump circulated the right-wing grapevine, but anxiety persisted. How long would Iran really maintain its fire and suspense? Would Israel defy popular opinion and retaliate? Was it peace, or the next of a very, very long series of shadow and retribution? Dust had barely begun to settle when politicians around the globe were analyzing the ceasefire. Hope was on the headlines, but there were also those who knew that the Middle East never provided clean conclusions. The Israeli-Iranian ceasefire was not a result of faith. It was signed out of exhaustion, worldwide pressure, and realization on both sides that fighting further would bring apocalypse, revenge on both. In Iran, political debate was given a life of its own. State television aired clips of missile tests, Israeli tanks set afire, and defiant addresses by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. President Masoud Pezeshkian himself, a pragmatic Iranian politician, framed the ceasefire in terms of evidence of Iran's strategic patience and resolve. But behind closed doors, Tehran's top leadership was conflicted about it. Hardline politicians criticized the regime for surrendering too early, and moderate elements foretold economic devastation on the horizon with reimposed sanctions and global isolation. Iran's economy bled. Sanctions by America cut oil exports to zero before 2 weeks of war had passed. The war merely added to the sequel. The Persian Gulf shunned tankers, foreign investors pulled out, and inflation reached record levels. But the regime started to get to work presenting survival itself as a triumph, a surefire method of guaranteeing internal stability, while regular Iranians queued up for basics, fuming with anger below the surface. Conversely, in Israel, it was celebratory, but with an optimistic touch and touches of grieving. Veteran Israeli politician and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had declared that the operation was a success, asserting Iran's nuclear ambitions had been held back by years. Military photography lingered on precision bombing, destroyed bomb shelters, and Iranian-fired missiles burst and detonate harmlessly into the Mediterranean. But the price too was paid. Israeli citizens numbered in their dozens, Haifa and Beersheba cities devastated by Iranian drones, and thousands left homeless as air raid sirens wailed day and night. But for Netanyahu, the ceasefire was a political lifesaver. His government was reeling from fierce local resistance to accusations of corruption and a beleaguered parliament. The successful repulsion of Israeli airspace incursions and triumphant retaliatory missions pumped popular morale, even the self-assurance of critics who had been worried about his abilities. But peace was precarious, and the Israelis understood that although bombs did not rain down from above, the threat had not yet passed. The world was split on how to respond globally. America, being one of the key signatories to the ceasefire treaty, emerged as the balancing force in the region. Washington used the chance to boast about U.S. diplomatic leverage and backrooms while concealing the truth that the peace was tenuous. In the backdrop, Washington's intelligence network had sharp ears and eyes, perpetually listening and looking out, knowing that a wayward missile or proxy militant strike might reignite the conflict at notice. As for this, European nations rushed in to take over the vacuum. France and Germany called for emergency discussions for new Iranian nuclear aspiration talks. China, new regional superpower in the Middle East, was behind the scenes mediator, eager to spread its role further. Russia, Iran's longtime ally, walked hand in hand with the ceasefire in the open, but secretly continued to help Iranian arms supply. But under diplomatic doublespeak, the strategic reality was this: Israel and Iran did not fully trust one another. Both had spent decades accumulating their tank, cyber, and regional patron arsenals for precisely this moment. The interlude was not the beginning of peace, it was an intermission in an unfinished drama penned in blood, history, and ideological rivalry. As the world observed this hesitant confrontation, it was one thing for sure: this wasn't an Iran and Israel narrative. This was a story of Middle Eastern design in its entirety, built on past grievances, proxy conflicts, extraneous parties, and the wafer-thin thread of energy security that tugged global markets on strings. Take Hezbollah, for instance, the Lebanese militant organization, most commonly known as Iran's most powerful regional proxy. Quiet hours, however, their commander Hassan Nasrallah broadcast Iran's heroic defense and gave a veiled message to remain in the rear. Hezbollah's rocket arsenal of 500,000 rockets was silent during the 12-day war. Why? Commentators were wondering. Some maintained Iran simply couldn't have opened so many fronts. Others claimed Israel's implicit threats to bomb Beirut if Hezbollah joined the conflict had intimidated them into submission. But everybody understood Hezbollah's silence was strategy, not defeat. The movement's power was a powder keg waiting to explode if this shaky ceasefire broke down. They had below them Houthis in Yemen, a militia supported by Iran, waging drone and missile strikes, but these targeted mainly Saudi and UAE. Their indirect but highly useful contribution towards this greater war was to engage Gulf monarchies so that they would be preoccupied and therefore provide Iran strategic depth so that Israel's Arab allies would have an uncoordinated one. Even in rightful Israel, the ceasefire caused general political upheaval. Israel's opposition charged Netanyahu's administration with short-sightedness, to be congratulatory of military victory, but lacking political vision for the future. Ordinary Israelis, especially those near the Gaza border and northern suburbs that had been shelled by Hezbollah, were cynical. They'd experienced ephemeral ceasefires in the past. Each time peace hadn't lasted. Iranian internal politics were no easier. Official announcements of triumph aside, the Iranian people, already battered by inflation, unemployment, and shrinking access to the basics, were weary, not euphoric. Reformer dissidents, already vocal in their opposition to the regime's hardline foreign policy, used these occasions to demand openness and accountability. But national security again acted to cloak the regime, which stifled the opposition with round-the-clock detention and confrontations with demonstrators in Tehran and Shiraz. The ceasefire economically gave world markets a temporary reprieve. Oil prices raised by nearly 20% during the war in preparation for the shutdown of offshore oil route Strait of Hormuz stabilized. But Iran still reserved some wild card to play, warned energy officials that would shut off supplies if tensions flared again. 1/3 of the world's liquefied natural gas and much of its crude oil flow through the strait, a bottleneck of a few miles width that Iran repeatedly threatened to close during increased hostilities. In this case, back-channel talks gained momentum. Oman, the low-key Gulf intermediary, covertly acted as intermediary between Iranian and Western policymakers. Qatar facilitated indirect dialogue between Iran and Israel through having one such relationship with the latter and one close relationship with Iran that was not ruptured. Even Saudi Arabia, longtime Iran antagonist, saw an opportunity. Guarded Riyadh expressed willingness to help toward more regional de-escalation if security needs of its own were fulfilled. But as with the veteran players, no Middle Eastern ceasefire is ever in a vacuum. All moves were observed by other world powers: Russia, China, the European Union, each with a stake in the result. The Israel-Iran ceasefire was more of a reprieve than a conclusion, but a carefully devised one in a much larger, still uncompleted game of chess in which one misplayed move would send the region and the world for that matter into chaos all over again. Days ahead, owners of spy satellites across the globe scrambled to know what they would do next. Spy satellites flew over Iranian bases at the behest of intelligence officers. Cyber spies ramped up surveillance, intercepting Tehran, Damascus, Baghdad clandestine communications. Israeli defense officials raised an eyebrow knot. Although theoretically there was a ceasefire, the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, were more than ever vigilant, only too painfully aware that Iran's roster of regional surrogates was an armed volcano, silent to the outside world but potent beneath. The Biden White House officially credited diplomatic pressure with the ceasefire, thankful to nod in the direction of timing sensitivity. Senior Washington officials warned that this fragile peace was not to be equated with real peace. Behind closed doors, Pentagon war planners redrew contingency plans for everything from limited proxy war through full-scale regional war. The nuclear issue hung over everything like the elephant in the room. Even were Iranian facilities destroyed in Israeli preemptive strikes, Western intelligence believed Tehran's nuclear aspirations had not been eliminated but delayed. Iran had dispersed its nuclear operations over years at secret facilities, underground bunkers, and overseas clandestine activities. Its facilities destroyed, the technical knowledge stockpiles of enriched uranium and scientific personnel remained intact. This was a skeptical test of policymakers. Would Iran actually negotiate, or would it exploit the ceasefire to rebuild, rearm, and resume its nuclear costs? There were few grounds for hope given by the past. Previous agreements, from the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, to more recent Gulf talks, had ended in mutual suspicion, internal political tension, and external regional meddling. Following is another argument on this topic. At the same time, responses around the world signaled the fragmentation of global diplomacy. Beijing wanted to brag about its rising power by being a willing mediator of broader peace talks and a future preference over Western-mediated discussions. Beijing's entry wasn't so much aloof. China's massive energy imports heavily depend on Middle East stability. Every exchange traded between Israel and Iran could destabilize Beijing's economic interest. Russia was a toss-up. Theoretically, Moscow demanded restraint, urging both sides to respect the ceasefire. In diplomatic courtesy, however, Russia continued to prod Iranian military modernization along with cutting-edge missile technology and air defense systems. To the Kremlin, an ever-stable Middle East kept Western great powers at bay and world energy markets in tumult, something that generally worked for Moscow. Inside Iran, anger and relief erupted at the ceasefire. There were economic attacks, food prices soared, the rial collapsed, and unemployment sped up. But the regime asserted itself more firmly, capitalizing on the ceasefire as a strategic victory, which had shown that Iran could withstand Western aggression. State media deluged TV screens with images of defiant leaders, missile parades, and calls for Iran's unbreakable resistance. In Israel, the citizens were passionately divided. Shattered by years of rocket shelling and threat of annihilation, some of the citizens called for promised permanent guarantees of safety, albeit at the cost of increasing military escalation. Others, especially young people, detested the useless war and retaliation syndrome and insisted on diplomatic moves to end the stalemate. But as warning analysts had cautioned, the Middle East had learned of ceasefires before, temporary, fleeting, and most often broken by the same arms that had ushered them in. The Israel-Iran 2025 ceasefire was balanced on a fulcrum at a moment of truth. It was a test of political will, but of whether decades' tallies were ever to be swapped for a sincere gesture toward de-escalation, or this was the calm before the next inevitable tempest. As the world reluctantly adapted to the ceasefire, one truth had a greater impact than any of the negotiators' words: there was no chance for actual peace. Politically, behind the scenes, Iran and Israel never lost focus on plotting the next war, keeping low-key, stockpiling their own arsenals, getting with each other in alignments, and re-practicing strategy for a try neither ever actually thought was accomplished. For Iran, the ceasefire provided time. Its infrastructure was shattered, but its defense network lost not a single day. Bunkers underground and new secret locations were beginning to rebuild anew. Iranian defense specialists, engineers, and technicians, some of whom had been trained abroad, worked day and night to keep Iran's nuclear ambitions publicly peaceful, secretly suspected otherwise on schedule. Tehran's policy was as much restraint as deterrence, weathering economic sanctions while consolidating power in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Israel also held firm, deterrence through domination. United States intelligence sharing was heightened. Laser defense systems of Iron Dome and systems thereafter were augmented along northern and central Israel. IDF cyber commandos battle-hardened for decades, and the virtual battle space increased activity against Iranian networks. Israeli policymakers well understood, though the bombs no longer rained, the actual battlefield was much farther than visual ranges, cyberspace-based shadow wars and proxy wars. World efforts to make ceasefire end maintenance diplomacy were one-sided. European nations demanded new nuclear talks as suspicion hit record stratospheric levels. JCPOA destruction by turbulences of the past created in the region was sufficient to keep diplomats busy. Qatar, Oman, and even Turkey offered mediating platforms, but Israeli-Iranian suspicion went decades deep, rooted in ideology, religion, and memories of previous war. But above all, there was the price in human lives, one too easily pushed to the fringes of geopolitics. In Israel, parents lost sons and daughters, wives lost their husbands, and citizens endured the psychic toll of ongoing sirens and uncertainty. In Iran, citizens endured deeper poverty, blackouts, and the specter of foreign air bombing as new normal. Younger generations in each nation were shouting in outrage. Social media platforms were channels for expressing outrage. Israeli youth demanded war accountability without apology. Iranians ridiculed the priorities of the regime as sanctions dismantled the economy. But peace messages were shouted down by nationalist drum beats and government propaganda that stuck to the same issues which had initiated the war. Meanwhile, global markets held their breath. Oil markets remained in suspense, investors danced on a tightrope, and the specter of war resumption loomed over energy pipelines critical to the global economy. The Strait of Hormuz, though once again open to trade flows, still constituted a politico-geostrategic choke point that could remain susceptible to future hotspots. Within the whirlwind of Middle Eastern history, Israel-Iran's 2025 ceasefire will be remembered one day as a turning point, or just another temporary fix before vengeance becomes the cycle again. Only time will tell if either leadership has the vision to end years of animosity or decades of suspicion will push the region further into chaos. For now, missiles are placed on the ground, the sky is blue, and world leaders dance to their victory. But where it matters, war machinery never stops. And peace in the Middle East always rests on the most peaceful stage before another storm.